What are the ethical consequences of using AI in software development? This is a question that I keep having for myself and for others. And I think it's a very important question. I also think it's a question that will not make a lot of difference in the adoption of large language models for software development. And this is what I'd like to discuss today. Welcome back to Think Design Work Smart. I'm Alex Bolboaca and I'm coming at you from an undisclosed location, this time not from the Mozaic Works studios. And I would like to tackle the issue of the ethical use of large language models in software development. So not in general, because the general case it's much more complicated, and I am focused on software development. And for this, I found an article that I will be using. The article is called, it's actually a paper, Navigating LLM Ethics, Advancements, Challenges, and Future Directions. It was published on 14 May 2024. The link is in the description, so you can read the whole article. I'm not going to read everything, but I found a very interesting part of it, where is this table that lists the most important ethical concerns about large language model. And I will discuss those in the context of software development. But another thing that I like to say is that, as I said in the beginning, I don't believe this will make any difference for the adoption of these technologies. Fortunately or unfortunately, software development is a very pragmatic industry. So there is little concern, I would say, for ethical considerations. I'm sure this concern varies, so I don't want to generalize, right? I mean, you'll find individuals that are very interested in the ethical concerns related to a certain technology, to certain uses, and so on. And this is what raised full communities, typically the Free Software Foundation, free software communities, the open source communities. So there are definitely people who are individually interested in these topics. You'll also hear a lot of large companies saying and talking about, yeah, we need to be ethical, and ethics is a very important part of our work, and so on. Now, if you look at their actions, what this translates to more often than not is this legal or not? If it's a legal problem, they definitely have a problem with that. With ethical problems that are not illegal, that's, we have places to go to, let's say. So this is the general state of software development. And so what you'll have is things like IP, copying, and copyright infringement, and a lot of problems that plague this industry. Now, again, I don't want to generalize, okay? So if you are in a team, if you're working in a team that doesn't do these things, great, more power to you. I like to see more people like that. But the general ecosystem is companies will do things for profit and be very careful related to legal concerns, and the ethical concerns will differ depending on, let's say, the potential punishments or downsides of them being caught. This is my general feeling. Maybe I am a little bit cynical about this. You can tell me that this is wrong, and I hope it is. But what I've seen in this industry is generally among these trends. So no matter of the ethical concerns that we'll discuss today that are very important, unless there's strong pressure on these companies, what they will do is they will look at legal cases, they will look at potential commercial gains, and they will go with it. Which is why I believe some of the things that we discuss today will not be as important for the adoption of large language models. Some of them will, because they do affect commercial and image of companies. So this is the framework that we'll be working through when it comes to ethical concerns on the use of large language models in software development. So let's start from these first lines. The first line, they split it into major ethical codes, minor ethical codes, but to me the titles are very interesting, so I'm going to focus on those. Ethical concerns in large language models, and here we have a list. Bias and fairness. So it's possible that and it's very likely that your foundational model is biased. And the question is how to make this fair. In terms of software development, well, we are creating code. Can you create unfair implementations? Maybe. I think this is a less pressing concern. I believe it's more pressing when it comes to not to the creation of the code, but to the actual features that you are implementing. I mean, if you are using a large language model as part of your system, maybe to identify images, maybe to generate CVs or to evaluate CVs, stuff like that, obviously there can be bias there. But when you use a large language model to generate code or to generate architectural diagrams, there's less concern for bias and fairness, right? Maybe there are some edge cases that I cannot see, but obviously I don't see a lot here. Privacy and data security. This is a big concern particularly for large companies. So let's say I'm using an open, a cloud-based large language model like ChatGPT or Claude, and I'm giving it private company data. So this would be commercial data. I'm giving it maybe access to lists of customers or stuff like that. The question is, what will that model do with this information? And the answer is, we don't know. They promise they won't use it in many situations, but is that true? It's very hard to prove. So here the best thing you can do is to work on general problems using these cloud-based models, assuming they help, right? And have local models that you can feed private data, commercial data into, and those models are jailed in into an enclave that cannot access the internet or can only access specific sites or whatever. So this is something that you can do nowadays. Are those models as good as ChatGPT or Anthropic or the cloud-based ones? Well, not really. There is Llama and there is DeepSeek. These are two models that you can install locally, you can use. There are many others, but these are, let's say, the top. Of course, this requires more infrastructure on your side. You need to have powerful computers that can run this, so on. So, is this a perfect solution? No, but nothing is in software development. So there is an option here to train models. So for example, in terms of software development, one thing you can do is to have a local model feed the diagrams that you have and then see whether you need to, you can have conversations with the assistant in order to generate ideas for improving your architecture, right? Again, assuming this is helpful, because it might not be helpful. So privacy and data security, this is the only way I can see we can do this. I wouldn't trust at this point, and I think most companies from a legal perspective don't trust these AI companies yet. I think there are some large companies that say that do. I believe most of them are in US and Asia, but for European companies it seems to be not that widespread use and very limited. Third one, misinformation and disinformation, obviously an issue with large language models, but it doesn't really apply to software development because the code needs to work. One thing you can do though that fits this information, you can inject insecure code. So if you go to a large language model, you ask it to generate solution in code for a specific problem, it might give you code that is insecure, and you use that code. If you use that code without reviewing it, you might introduce security issues into your code base. So that is a potential problem that fits kind of with the disinformation part. And be very aware that hackers are working at it. So one thing that large language models would do is to generate libraries, references to libraries that don't actually exist. But the hackers have figured out which libraries are usually referenced by these large language models, and they have created them. So you can actually use a hacked library and introduce insecure code in your system by using large language models. So you need to be very careful what you do and what code you accept from these assistants. Transparency and accountability, this may be an issue, although the scenario I'm thinking about here is a developer, architect, software developer of any form, tester, uses a large language model, but then the results are their responsibility. So it's not like you can blame ChatGPT that it introduced security issues. It's your problem that you listen to ChatGPT. This is definitely a problem in other situations, obviously. Intellectual property and plagiarism. Now, this is a big one. The large language models have been trained on code available on the internet, and most of that code is open source. Open source code means a very specific thing. It means that you are allowed to copy that code, well, depending on the license, but let's say you are allowed to copy and use that code, but if you make any modifications to that code, then you need to publish as open source the resulting modifications. So this is a share alike clause, or copy left clause is also known as. So the problem now is you take the open source code, you feed it into a large language model, you prompt it for a specific problem, it spews out code. Is that code breaching the copyright of the open source code? And if we are discussing on ethical grounds, these companies took for free a lot of the information available on the internet, used it, and created these large language models. So on ethical grounds, I would definitely agree that they should pay for what they have been using. And this is a perfectly good reason for you to not use large language models. However, my fear is that, or my conclusion, or let's say prediction, is that companies will wait for legal cases on this topic to be settled and then decide accordingly and ignore the ethical consideration. So ethically, yes, I believe the people who worked on open source projects that were used in the creation of these large language models, they should be paid. Now OpenAI and all the AI companies tell you, well, if we pay them, then we don't have a business. Which is a very weird thing, because I remember a few years ago when we had the whole piracy debacle, and when they were saying copying anything is theft, you know. If you copy a movie from the internet, that's theft. But if you copy the whole internet with all the text, all the images, all the code from the internet, apparently that's not theft anymore. So it's obviously a double standard here. But regardless of your personal feelings and the ethical consideration here, what I believe will happen is that there will be legal cases. There are some legal cases actually right now litigated. And those legal cases, once settled, companies will decide to use or not to use these models based on the advantages they provide, and not on this ethical consideration. Maybe there will be some kind of tax that they need to pay, and maybe they will decide that it's fair use clause, so that the OpenAI is actually using fairly everything that is on the internet, despite the licenses associated with it. Maybe there will be something else. We yet don't know what the legal case will be. So this is a big problem, and we'll need to figure it out. Another thing here is, let's say that you prompt the large language model for a certain solution to a certain problem. And the code it generates is almost exactly the same as the original code that it was trained on. Is this a copyright infringement? And now I'm talking, forget for a moment about the ethical dilemma. The question is this a copyright infringement in legal terms? And that's one of the big questions that is currently asked in courts of law. So we'll need to see what happens there. Access and inequality, less of a problem in software development, although there might be one. If these tools become very important, it's likely that for software development, it's likely that some companies will train even better models that fit their organization and that could theoretically speed up their own development, which means that they will be raising inequality between different organizations of different sizes. However, it can also work the other way. Maybe smaller companies that have fewer constraints can use these large language models to speed up their development and therefore be more of a competition for the large companies. Currently, we honestly don't know where this is going. We'll have to see. I'm not sure which way it will go. My feeling is that there will be a mix of things. The biggest question here is how useful are actually these models? Because if I spend a lot of time and money and resources to build up a model that theoretically speeds my development 100 times, let's say, something big like that, but then it turns out that it just works for 2 months and then I have to fix everything manually because nothing works anymore. Well, this is again a very possible scenario depending on how you use the large language model. Reinforcement of societal prejudices, again, unlikely for software development, big problem for other things. Data breaches, this is linked with what I discussed before. What if you give data to an open, a commercial cloud-based model, and it uses the data to train its model, and then other people can recover the data? That would be a data breach. Question is, who is responsible for that? Are you responsible because you gave this data? Is the AI company responsible because it used it and because it didn't take enough measures to avoid these breaches? It's a very gray legal ground. Public safety, not so much for software development. Also misleading content, manipulation of public opinion, discrimination, marginalized group. These are not that important for software development. They don't apply. They apply, of course, to other areas of AI. But let me focus on another one, environmental impact. Environmental impact of large language models is obviously very high. And it is very high because these models require large data centers that are consuming a lot of energy. So first of all, energy consumption, big problem. the energy consumption has gone up to the point where large companies in US have started building or making contracts with nuclear power plants so that they have enough power supplied for the data centers. And this is mind-boggling. This is not something that we expected a few years ago when we started discussing about reducing energy consumption and things like that. Now, let's say we accept that nuclear energy is a pretty good source of energy. It doesn't emit, it doesn't pollute that much. There's actually very low pollution, as far as I know, with nuclear power plants. So let's say that this is a solved problem. But the next problem is cooling. These data centers need to be cooled. How do you cool them? Well, you need a lot of water, apparently. So consuming water in the context of environmental changes, big problem. So I'd place the environmental impact as a pretty high ethical issue. Now, question is, will large companies care about the environmental impact of using large language models? And my guess is no. They will probably say things like, these are tools that are mandatory for the business today, and therefore we are obligated to use those and stuff like that. So there will be some PR stunts here to allow this to happen. But ethically, yeah, environmental impact, big problem. I can definitely understand anyone who doesn't want to use large language models because of their environmental impact. Unfortunately, I believe that pragmatically this will matter much less than we might like to. The next topic is ethical frameworks and platforms in large language models. And they talk about responsible deployment. I don't know what this is. Human-centered network framework. Don't know what this is. Let's see a few others. Intentional misuse. Intentional misuse in software development would be something like, I create on purpose code that is harmful to the organization. And I haven't thought about this scenario. This is something that you could do previously as well, but you can do it much faster with large language models and maybe in a much more convoluted or hidden way. Now, if the correct processes are in place and you're doing code reviews and so on, this is not as big as a problem. But who knows? I don't know. Unintentional harm. This is possible, of course. You could introduce, as we discussed, you could introduce bad code unintentionally if you don't pay enough attention. One thing that I'm interested in is it's called here users' mental models, but I'm gonna link it to something else. The problem with any tool like this one, actually the problem with any tool is that once you start using that tool, you forget the ways you were doing things before. It's very easy for people to get accustomed to tools. We are tool users, right? And if you once you get accustomed to a tool, you lose the ways you were doing things before. Sometimes that's a good thing because this is progress. Sometimes it's not that great because those things are the ones that were actually better, were actually required. So one phenomenon that can happen and that I understood is already starting to happen is junior developers use large language models to generate code for them, and therefore they don't have the tools, the skills, the abilities to develop code otherwise, right? And this can become a big problem in the near future, because what this effectively means is that we will get to a population of developers who are just users of large language models and then don't actually know how to write code that works in a professional environment. And we'll have the older guys who know, and not only guys, but mostly guys, unfortunately, that know how to write this code and who will be called to fix a bunch of issues introduced by large language models. And this is a very poor model for a sustainable and professional software development enterprise. And the question is, are we going there? And what are we doing to prevent it? The way I'm thinking about this is you should not use large language models for generated code unless you actually know how to write that code. And this would mean a progressive adoption. So assuming that these tools become widespread in the industry, this will assume a progressive adoption of these tools as you advance in your career. Think about it like, let's say if you are a driver, okay? Maybe first you get a license for a small car, and then you get a license for a tractor, and then a license for a bus, and a license for a transportation vehicle, and so on. This would be kind of similar to this. Or maybe if you are a doctor, you first have a basic right to prescribe a limited set of medication, and then once you go past a certain level, you get full rights for more medication, and then you get rights for even rarer medication, and so on. So this is the kind of progression that we will need if you want to have a sustainable software development in the future. Now, this assumes that we don't get AGI, the general intelligence. And this is the assumption I'm operating upon. I don't believe we'll get AGI in the next 5 to 10 years. I believe that the only way to get to AGI will be to shift the paradigm that we are currently using for AI. I don't think large language models are enough. There may be a part of it, but I don't believe they are enough. And everything right now points in this direction. Every declaration, every statement from that is official, right, from OpenAI, from the AI companies, points in this direction. But if we get AGI, maybe we won't need software development at all anymore, software developers, right? So, but we'll see. I'm not sure. My belief is that we won't see that. as soon as they claim. Okay, let's talk about another set is bias and fairness in large language models. I'm looking through this. I don't believe this applies to software development. Privacy and data security. Safeguarding sensitive information. Privacy risks. Mitigation techniques. Privacy preserving methods. Differential privacy, maintaining utility and accuracy. Integrating privacy preserving techniques. Rigorous data security standards. Again, the big point here is never pass company information, user information, other private information to a cloud-based large language model, because we actually don't know what's happening there. If you want to use this type of information with large language models, you need to create a local model. Make sure it cannot access the internet, or at least monitor its internet access, and use that. Train that, use it. You need a private one. And even that you need to monitor very carefully. So, yeah. And we probably need better standards than what we have now. Misinformation and disinformation, as I said, this doesn't really apply. It applies for security things, particularly for spreading hacked libraries and references to those libraries in your code. Let's see if we have anything else that's interesting. Mitigation strategies in large language model ethics. Hallucination prevention. That's one interesting one. So one big problem with large language models is that they can generate code that either doesn't work, uses libraries that don't exist, and so on. In large companies, this should be less of a problem because you cannot actually use libraries unless they are approved by IT companies, by security department. In smaller companies, this may be a risk, so you need to pay attention to that. But I would really advise you to focus on using some kind of incremental process. I believe test-driven development works very well in this context, because the thing that you can do is to figure out what's the next part of the problem that I want to solve. Write a test for that. If you want, you can generate it with a large language model, because you can verify it. It tends to be very short. And then generate with a large language model the code that would match this, and then verify. And if you do this in short cycles, it's very unlikely that hallucinations will affect you. But it's one of the best ways of dealing with this. And I think I'm gonna stop here, because there's a little bit more here. There's censorship, intellectual property, and plagiarism. I believe we covered that. Abusive LLM, hate speech, and cyberbullying, unlikely to be a problem in software development. Auditing LLMs, this is a general problem, and it applies to software development as well. But I think what is a conclusion of all this is there are some big ethical challenges, privacy, security, and when we talk about software development. So privacy, security, environmental impact, big one. There are these issues I still don't believe until all the lawsuits with regarding IP and copyright will be sorted out. There will be a period of adjustment, but once those are sorted out, it's very likely that we'll get a framework for using large language models inside organizations, and they will use it. This is my conclusion. It depends a lot on how useful these models prove to be, because right now, one article that I've seen recently is that most AI initiatives fail. And there's a question here, how useful is to use these models? But assuming they will be useful, assuming the lawsuits will sort out in a year or two, this will be free space for organizations to start using those. And this is why I believe that, and based on my experience, seeing that large language models are very useful at some things, not very useful at other things, I believe that this change is inevitable. Okay, there are still some stumbling blocks, but I don't think it will stop. I will be very surprised if something makes this change stop. And once it starts getting into organizations, it will affect every part of the organization. So this is why I said in the past this is equivalent with the Industrial Revolution. And we saw now the ethical concerns. I agree. These are important. I also believe pragmatically they won't matter as much as we would love to. With this being said, this is maybe a more controversial episode or video of on our channel. What are your thoughts? What are your feelings about this? Have you used large language models? Do you refuse to use them based on these ethical concerns, and which ones of them? Let's have a conversation about this. I believe this is a very complex topic. In some parts it's very clear, in other parts it's also mediated by pragmatism and commercial use in most cases. Thank you kindly for the view, and until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart. See you next Saturday.